This is your tutorial for the long essay in the APUS history class. For those of you who are taking my AP World History class as well right now at UCLA, you're going to notice a lot of overlap here. So if you looked at the AP World History tutorial on this, it's pretty much the same. The only difference really is in the synthesis comment. In the synthesis part of the essay, AP World History gives 3 different possibilities for what the students can do. In APUS History, there are only 2 options they can do, and it's the same that we've gone over in the DBQ. So if you've watched the AP World History tutorial, you're welcome to use that as your base model to then go and do the mock rating. For those of you who aren't taking that particular class, hopefully this APUS History long essay tutorial will help. Both in establishing for your students how to write the long essay, as well as some rubric ideas for how to grade it. So first of all, long essays now are the final conclusion to what used to be the free response questions, or the FRQ, at the end of the APUS history essay. The long essay provides students with 2 choices. We're pretty familiar with this in APUS history because in the past when we did free response questions, students always had 2 choices for the 2 different essay questions or FRQs at the end of the test. This really always led into something that I thought was so important for telling the students, and I have plenty of stories to talk about with this, in which students will choose questions that look really interesting, not the ones that they have the most knowledge about. So I think it's really important for students to be strategic. They need to look at the 2 choices that have been given to them, and they really need to ask themselves which one of the 2 they really know enough information on to provide an answer. Now, if they come across a choice that they're passionate about and they know the right answer about, this is really good for them. They've hit the sweet spot of their writing, but they really need to be strategic. The 2 choices that are offered will pretty much always provide a common thinking skill, but from a different time period. So for example, in the last few years, we've seen the turning point essay or periodization essay, but just for different time periods for each one of the choices. Students are going to get 35 minutes to write their long essay and plan their essay. So students can expect the following types of long essays. Students can expect a comparison contrast, change in continuity, cause and effect, periodization, or argumentation. Now, when I first heard about this, I thought it was great. All these skills I think are awesome for the APUS history test, but it hit me at the beginning of the year, wait a second, we're talking about here about 6 different types of essays that we would have to practice regularly, plus the DBQ. It would just be impossible not only to teach all these skills in essay format, but then on top of that to practice them regularly with the students. But here's the good news that I found. Really when it comes down to it, this boils down to 2 possibilities. Students are either going to get a long essay test on the change in continuity or comparison and contrast. So how can I say that? Well, comparison and contrast obviously stands apart from the other possible answers here. All of the others really fit under change in continuity. Cause and effect and periodization are all about change. They don't have the continuity aspect, which is why I think it's important to teach the kids that they need to check and see what kind of essay is being asked for, if they're being asked to do continuity. But really in the end, it's all about cause and effect, cause and consequence. As far as argumentation goes, if you're teaching them comparison and contrast, if you're teaching them change in continuity, they're learning the skills of argumentation. We all know argumentation is about setting up a specific argument, a thesis, providing a variety of different examples to support that, and then providing analysis. So really when it comes down to it, you're really talking about teaching 2 possibilities, change in continuity, comparison and contrast, and then teaching the students a little bit of nuance depending upon the type of essay that they might hit. So a suggested template that I use with the students. I always have them start off their introduction as a thesis, and that's it. I know in their English classes they're taught to do a hook sentence. They're then taught to do some context, sort of like our contextualization with DBQ, and then getting into the thesis. But in this particular case, your audience isn't looking for that. The audience is looking for a thesis. So have them jump right into the thesis, have them indent and make that a separate paragraph, but it should be 2 to 3 sentences, provides a specific answer to the prompt, and this is really important. I can't tell you how many times it's national grading. Students get docked a lot of points because they don't answer all parts of the prompt. This in and of itself is a huge skill for students to get. They should answer their thesis, including both a thinking skill and the theme that's being asked for. And they need to make sure they provide a reason for this. So they need to provide analysis for their argument with organizational categories. Now after that, they're going to write multiple body paragraphs. And what I suggest is their body paragraphs should follow this model. First off, they need to start off with a topic sentence. It's very important not to jump into the examples. Start with a topic sentence that provides a specific argument based upon the historical thinking skill. And you're going to see why in a minute. In the rubric, this is one of the points the students have to hit, is the thinking skill. After that, students should provide what we call the rule of three, meaning in each body paragraph, they should aim for about 3 historical examples. Now, students get a little bit freaked out by this, and they always think, well, rule of three must mean I've got to hit it, otherwise I'm going to be knocked down on points. And what I'd like to tell them is it's not really a rule of three, it's more like a guideline of three. We call it rule of three just because it rolls off the tongue a little bit easier, but it really is a guideline of 3. If one of your body paragraphs has 2 examples or another one has 4, nobody's really going to care. But if you're trying to aim for about 3 examples per paragraph, this means you're going to provide a good, sufficient amount of evidence. Now, what's important is that students provide a description of these examples and state how the examples support the argument. And that really gets to that final sentence of the paragraph, in which I would suggest they provide an analysis statement, a reason why the change in continuity or comparison and contrast has occurred. So the concluding paragraph, very much like the DBQ, the conclusion needs to be a synthesis statement. And in APUS history, there are 2 different options they can do. Either add on a category not in the question. So if the question is about politics, they can talk about economics. Or provide a connection to another time period. Now, for me personally, I really like the latter one, providing a connection to another time period. I think it just makes sense to the students because this is the way we tend to think about why we study history. History is about establishing parallels or connections between time periods so that we can learn about how time periods relate to our own. I just think this makes the most amount of sense to students. But if a student should decide to do the first, adding on a category, they can also get points for their synthesis that way as well. So, when the students get graded, how are they evaluated and how should you evaluate during the mock grading? At the national grading, they're going to get evaluated on the following points. First, do they have a thesis? If they do, they get a point. Now, the thesis has to do everything we talked about earlier, but if they do that, they get a point. Next, they've got to provide the historical thinking skill, which is for 2 points. So where are these 2 points coming from? 1 point is for providing the historical thinking skill. So they can talk about change in continuity, comparison, contrast, periodization, etc. But they also have to provide a reason for the historical thinking skill. If they only provide the thinking skill and just address it, that's not enough. They've got to provide a qualitatively good reason for why this change in continuity happened, comparison and contrast, and so on. Next up, very similarly, is evidence. They will get 1 point for providing relevant examples, but then they also have to provide a description and analysis of the examples to get the full 2 points. And then last off is synthesis, where they can earn a point for either adding on a category or making a connection to another period. Now, I want to get into a brief discussion, though, on rubric grading, because I think this is really important, especially for those of us in APUS history, because we've really made a huge shift, whether we like it or not, in the philosophy of how we do grading. And I would say that this is the shift from holistic to dimensional scoring grading. We in APUS history used to do holistic scoring, which a lot of us are familiar with because that used to be the way we were graded in college. And the idea is an overall assessment of the skills and themes that are in an essay. This used to be our approach a couple years ago in APUS history, and it definitely had advantages. It gave teachers far more discretion for judging the categories in the overall essay. The disadvantage is that it's not as quantifiable, and it can lead to very different evaluations based upon a singular teacher or multiple teachers as to how they look at an overall essay. So what we've moved to now is something called dimensional scoring, which is based upon numerical evaluations of very specific skills. This is a continuation of the way AP World History used to do evaluation, which was called asset grading. It's very similar to their ideas. The advantages are that there are very specific skills, and they are given a very specific numerical evaluation. So a thesis is given a certain amount of points, addressing historical skills are given an amount of points, and so forth. The disadvantage is that this can lead to fragmented grading of the overall essay. So we lose this idea of like an organic essay. So here's one possible resolution that I've come up with for dealing with the conflict between these 2 types of rubrics that I think are both very valuable to how we do grading. What I would suggest is looking at dimensional scoring as like benchmarks. Basically, each one of the major skills that we have is being given a numerical grading, and it helps the students to understand specifically the definitions for those skills and how you're going to weight those skills. And that really helps out, I think, a lot of students who are struggling with writing to really understand what are specific definitions of these skills and what can they do to get there. However, I think you can also retain some holistic grading within the numerical scores. So you can retain your discretion upon whether or not a student hits a particular numerical score. For example, let's say a student does provide examples in the essay with reasons, but you feel that the student hasn't really provided sufficient amount of examples, or really the priority types of examples that are meant to be used. You might end up giving them a point for providing some reasons for their examples, but when they come and challenge you and say, well, why didn't I get the 2 points? You can say, well, the reason why is you provided some reasons, but you didn't provide enough examples. You didn't provide the priority examples that we talked about in class. This really allows you to have the discretion to make qualitative judgments about what these skills are and whether or not the numerical weight has been achieved. It also means your students are going to be more prepared than what the exam is asking them to do. Because the national grading, really, students are going to be expected to just hit those skills. And if they've hit the skills, they'll get the points. But if you're requiring a higher level of hitting the skills, then throughout the year, the students will be challenged at a very strong level. And it's going to mean that they are going to be way over prepared for the test and more prepared for college. So I would suggest, when we're thinking about this grading, and when you do your mock grading this week, do the mock grading off of everything we've talked about up until the last 2 slides. But when you're starting to prepare for your classes, I would suggest possibly thinking about these last 2 slides as a way to combine together what you're used to in your grading and bring out the best styles of your grading, both the holistic side as well as the dimensional scoring side.